Exercise 1 deals with the language of anatomy. We tend to have a special vocabulary that we use when talking about the anatomy or the structure of the various parts of the human body and the relationships between those body parts. Physiology is going to refer to the function, how things are working. And just so you know, we often use the phrase structure determines function. Throughout biology in general, and certainly with A&P, that if you can look at the structure of something, it will give you clues as to what the function of that particular part is. There's a lot of vocabulary, so if you learn it now, it will make it a whole lot easier later because you're going to see a lot of these terms throughout the entire semester. So it's one of those things. Learn it easier in the very beginning, and then it just makes it easier for you throughout the semester. First thing is the anatomical position. This is a standard universal position that the body is in, and it makes it a little bit easier to make comparison and references to different areas. And so that anatomical position is considered the body standing straight up or erect. The head and the eyes are facing forward. Your upper limbs, your arms are down by your side with the palms facing forward. And then the lower limbs or the legs are together with the toes also facing forward. So as you can see in this picture, this individual is standing in the correct anatomical position. When we talk about different terms, the anatomical regions, the anatomical terms for different areas, as you can see here, several of them are diagrammed, listed. The anterior view is the front view, the posterior view is the back view. And once again, as I said, you need to learn these. There's just no other way around it. But just to give you an idea of why I'm saying this, it's best to learn it now, make it easier in the long run. The forearm area right here is known as the brachial or brachium region. So if you learn that now, it's the brachial region. When you go to study the muscles, you have the biceps brachia here. When you study the nerves, there's a brachial nerve in this region. There is a brachial artery that's in this area. And so that's why I'm saying if you learn it now, it just makes it so much easier later when we get into the specific systems in studying whether it's the blood vessels or the nerves or the muscles or the bones. It'll make it a whole lot easier. If I say something about the brachial artery, you would know immediately to look in this area and say not down here in the leg. So that's why I'm just saying to learn it now. One thing if you might find helpful is you can always Google. There's tons of images that you can find. Just go to Google Images if you want. Print out a picture, an unlabeled picture. You can find one in your lab manual. What I would recommend is one of two things. Some people like to get an anatomy coloring book, and I have found over the years that that is very helpful in learning a lot of these terms. But if you don't want to take the expense of that, because it can be expensive obviously, is like I say, just go to Google Images, print out one copy of an unlabeled diagram, and put it into a plastic sleeve. And then you can use a dry erase marker and practice labeling it, and then you wipe it clean and then start over again. And that way you're not making tons of photocopies. You only have one photocopy, but you keep practicing over and over with that. And then just collect them in a binder, if you will, in those plastic sleeves, and it's great for studying. With some of the anatomical terms, and these are listed in Table 1.1, you'll notice they're often in pairs. So superior means closer to the head, and the opposite of that would be inferior, which is closer to the feet. Sometimes you may see these listed as cranial versus caudal. So as an example that's given here, the lungs are superior to the stomach. You could also say the chin is superior to the shoulder. Anterior and posterior. Anterior is closer to the front, posterior is towards the back. These can also be used with ventral or dorsal. Now these three tend to go together. You have medial is closer to a midline. If you were to draw a line right down the middle of the body, so you'd be coming right down from your forehead, down through the nose, the middle of your mouth, down through the middle of your chest, etc., all the way down, right down the midline. As you go closer to that midline, we call that medial. Going away from it is lateral. And then if you're somewhere in between, it's intermediate. And so, excuse me, you could say that the ears are lateral to the eyes. Why? Because they're further away from the midline than what the eyes are. So oftentimes you're using these anatomical terms in a comparison, comparing one location to another location. Proximal and distal are used only with the limbs, only with the arms, only with the legs. And you're talking about relationships relative to the point of attachment to the main part of the body, to the trunk of the body. So proximal is going to be closer to the shoulder or closer to the hip. Distal will be further away from either the shoulder or the hip. Superficial and deep. Superficial is going to be closer to the surface. Also, this is referred to as external. And deep or internal is going to be further from the surface. And so this diagram is just showing some of these comparisons, these directional terms. And one thing just to keep in mind, I will mention right now on this diagram, as it is labeled right here, right and left, you're always referring to the patient's right and left, not yours. So you can see lateral and medial, this midline that would be drawn right down the middle of the body. Closer to that midline is medial, further away is lateral. Sectional anatomy, there are different planes that would pass through the body where you can do cuts. This is going to be very important in things such as if you're doing a CT scan, MRI scans, x-rays, etc. How are you looking at it? From what plane? Sagittal planes, this is basically a vertical plane that's going to be passing through the body. It's going to divide the body into a right and left side. Now, mid-sagittal means it's going right through that midline. And so you're going to have equal left side to the equal right side. Parasagittal is where it's still a sagittal, but it's not right down the midline. So your right and left sides are going to be unequal. A coronal or frontal plane, this is going to divide the body into an anterior and posterior portions. And then a transverse or horizontal plane is going to divide the body into superior and inferior portions. Let's say you are going to be doing a CAT scan. You need to know, depending on obviously the individual circumstances of what is going on with the patient, what the doctor has ordered, how they want to view things, as to how do they want to do this. Do they want to do what most people would call a cross section or a transverse plane, where you divide the upper and lower portion of the body, such as right here, or do you need to do a medial plane or a sagittal plane where you get to the right and left side of the body? Or once again, a frontal plane, which is going to divide into the front or the back. What is it that you're looking for? What information are you trying to gain? That determines what type of a view you need to see. So what type of a plane do you need to be looking at? The body has several different cavities. You're going to find out in anatomy we love to organize things and divide them and subdivide them. So I'm sorry, get used to it now. The axial division of the body contains two main body cavities. In the axial division, what we're referring to is basically what most people think of like the head and the trunk. It does not include the appendages, the arms and the legs. So the two main body cavities are going to be the dorsal cavity, also known as the posterior cavity. And within these cavities is your central nervous system. That is going to be subdivided into the cranial cavity, which basically is going to contain your brain. The skull is going to form protection around that cavity. And then the vertebral cavity, also sometimes known as your spinal cavity, that is going to be the cavity that holds your spinal cord. The ventral cavity is larger. It does have a division. The upper or superior portion is known as the thoracic cavity, and then the lower or inferior component is known as your abdominal pelvic cavity, sometimes known as the peritoneal cavity. And the division between these two is the diaphragm. That is what separates the two. Now, in the thoracic cavity, once again, we can divide this into smaller divisions. You're going to have two pleural cavities. These surround the lungs. And then in the middle region between the pleural cavities is the mediastinum. And this contains the pericardial cavity. That is what surrounds the heart. So your abdominal pelvic cavity is below the diaphragm. It is subdivided usually into what we call the abdominal cavity versus the pelvic cavity. And the pelvic cavity is inferior or below the abdominal cavity. There's not a distinct division between them. Kind of think along your hip bones as a guide. Most of the organs contained within your abdominal pelvic cavity are going to be involved with digestion, excretion, reproduction. There are some additional body cavities which are much smaller. There are several that are located in the head. Your orbital cavities, that contains your eyes. The nasal cavity, and also is going to contain the paranasal sinuses. And then the oral cavity, which is your mouth. We tend to study those cavities in more detail when we are studying number one, the skeletal system, and then the nasal cavities when we are looking at respiration, and the oral cavity when we are looking at digestion. So in this diagram, it is showing these different cavities. As you can see, it is color-coded. The yellow is showing the dorsal excuse me, body cavity, and the red is the ventral body cavity. So from a lateral view here, you can see up here is the cranial cavity that contains the brain, and then the vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. And then from, if you're moving more anterior direction or towards the front, you have your thoracic cavity, contains the heart and lungs. As I said earlier, the division is going to be the diaphragm, which is right here. And then below that, you have your abdominal pelvic cavity, which is subdivided into the abdominal cavity. And once again, just kind of think along the hips, and below that is the pelvic cavities. And from an anterior view here, once again, the cranial cavity, the vertebral cavity, which runs behind the ventral cavity. So here you can see from the anterior view the pleural cavities, which contain the lungs. You can see the pericardial cavity that would contain the heart. Once again, here is the diaphragm, which is that division between your abdominal, pelvic, and thoracic cavities. And then your abdominal cavity contains it's mostly your digestive. It also contains the kidneys for the urinary system. And then the pelvic cavity, which contains the bladder, reproductive organs, and things like the rectum from the digestive system. Regional anatomy, this is where we divide the torso into first quadrants. They can be divided into 4 different quadrants. Get used to this, being that we're being very nice in the naming of it. It actually makes sense. You have the right upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, and left lower quadrant. So this is a way of initially dividing the abdominal pelvic region into areas. Sometimes you may be talking with a patient, they're describing maybe where they're having discomfort or pain, and you need to write that down because you may not talk to the next healthcare professional that's going to see the patient. They're going to be looking at your notes. And so you need to be very clear about the location of where the discomfort is. And so this is one way of starting to narrow down. And always remember, once again, right and left refers to the patient, not to you. Now we can subdivide even smaller into regions. And you have, once again, right and left refers to the patient. You have the right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, and then the left hypochondriac region. If you go below that, then you have the right lumbar region, the umbilical region, and the left lumbar region. And then on the bottom row, if you will, below that would be the right iguanal region, the hypogastric or pubic region, and the left iguanal region. And in this picture, this is now overlying the quadrants, which is drawn with this dark blue line, the regions, which is drawn with the red lines, and it is now also underlying underneath that, showing you where some of the major organs are. So that can give you an idea. If a patient comes in and is having problems and experiencing pain, say in the left lumbar region over here, your guess is probably it's not the gallbladder. The gallbladder is up right over here. So start to get very familiar as you're studying these different regions, which organs are going to be located in which region. So this is your liver and your stomach. Your spleen is way over here on the left side, tucked kind of behind the stomach. Below the stomach is going to be the pancreas. You have the small intestines, which is most of this area here. Actually, can spill it most of your abdominal cavity area, and then your large intestines, which goes up, across, and then down over here, and then finally to the rectum. You have your urinary bladder. The reproductive organs are going to be in this area. The kidneys are behind the intestines, so you're not going to see those right there. Once again, just start practicing and learning the different regions, the different quadrants, the different anatomical terminology that we use, because we don't say, oh, the patient has a bruise on their kneecap. That's layman's terms. We would call it the patella. You've got the brachial region, the antebrachial region, the femoral region, etc. So you need to be familiar with those. Start learning them now. It'll make it so much easier for you later on.